On the surface, Stacey Castor's life in upstate New York appeared unremarkable, shaped by routine, responsibility, and the quiet stability of middle age. She lived with her husband, Michael Wallace, in a modest home where daily habits followed predictable patterns. Michael was attentive to his health, committed to exercise, and careful about what he consumed. Protein shakes were part of that routine, blended regularly and consumed without a second thought. There was nothing unusual about them, nothing that suggested danger. They were symbols of discipline and self-care, not instruments of harm. That normalcy would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of what followed. In January of 2002, Michael Wallace was found unresponsive in the couple's home. Emergency responders were called, and despite attempts to revive him, he was pronounced dead. He was 38 years old. The suddenness of his death shocked friends and family, but there were no immediate signs of violence or struggle. At first glance, it appeared to be a tragic medical event. Michael had complained of feeling unwell in the days before his death, experiencing nausea and discomfort that he attributed to a possible illness. Stacey told authorities that her husband had been sick, and nothing about her demeanor suggested alarm beyond the expected grief of a spouse who had just lost her partner. An autopsy was performed, and toxicology tests revealed elevated levels of antifreeze in Michael's system. Antifreeze contains ethylene glycol, a chemical that is sweet-tasting but highly toxic when ingested. The discovery raised immediate questions, but investigators were cautious. Antifreeze poisoning is rare and often associated with accidental ingestion, particularly when substances are improperly stored. Stacey explained that Michael had been working on his car and might have accidentally consumed the substance. The explanation, while unusual, was not impossible. Without clear evidence of intent or a history of conflict, Michael's death was ultimately ruled an accident. Life moved forward, though the loss left a visible mark. Stacey later remarried, building a new household and presenting herself as someone who had endured hardship and emerged resilient. Her second husband, David Castor, was described as gentle and trusting. He, too, focused on maintaining his health and followed structured routines. Within their home, protein shakes again became a familiar fixture, prepared and consumed regularly as part of daily life. The repetition of this detail would later stand out, though at the time it seemed inconsequential. In August of 2005, David Castor was found dead in the same home. Once again, the circumstances were sudden and confusing. David had complained of feeling ill, experiencing symptoms similar to those Michael had described years earlier. Stacey reported finding him unresponsive and called for help. He was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. The parallels between the two deaths were striking, though they were initially treated separately. David's passing was devastating to his family, who struggled to understand how a man in otherwise good health could die so unexpectedly. As with Michael, an autopsy was conducted. Toxicology results again showed the presence of antifreeze. This time, however, the explanation of accidental ingestion raised greater skepticism. Two husbands, both dying from the same rare poison under similar circumstances within the same household, was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Investigators began to look more closely at the details that had previously been overlooked. The routine consumption of protein shakes, the timing of the illnesses, and the fact that both men had relied on Stacey during their final days became central to renewed scrutiny. Despite the growing suspicion, the case did not immediately point to criminal intent. Stacey presented herself as cooperative and distraught. She maintained that she had no idea how antifreeze could have entered David's system and suggested that his death, like Michael's, was a tragic accident. The absence of witnesses and the private nature of the home complicated the investigation. There were no obvious signs of forced ingestion or struggle, and the poison itself is difficult to detect without specific testing. The uncertainty allowed doubt to persist. The situation took a dramatic turn when Stacey's teenage daughter, Ashley, was found unconscious in the home shortly after David's death. Beside her was a note that appeared to be a suicide letter, written in Stacey's handwriting but signed with Ashley's name. The note described distress, guilt, and a desire to escape. Emergency responders rushed Ashley to the hospital, where she survived after treatment. Doctors later confirmed that she too had ingested antifreeze. This time, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Investigators re-examined the note and the circumstances surrounding Ashley's condition. The language used did not align with Ashley's personality or previous behavior. Handwriting analysis confirmed that the note had been written by Stacey. Faced with mounting evidence, investigators began to piece together a disturbing narrative. The protein shakes, once symbols of health, emerged as a likely delivery method for the poison. The routine preparation of those drinks provided opportunity and concealment, allowing antifreeze to be administered without arousing suspicion. As the investigation deepened, the earlier ruling of Michael Wallace's death as accidental was reopened. The similarities between both cases, combined with the attempted framing of Ashley, painted a picture of calculated deception rather than misfortune. What had initially appeared as isolated tragedies were now understood as connected events. The ordinary rhythms of daily life, trusted habits, and quiet domestic spaces had been manipulated in ways few could imagine. By the time Stacey Castor was taken into custody, the story had shifted from unexplained loss to deliberate betrayal, revealing how something as simple as a protein shake could become the center of a carefully hidden crime. As investigators formalized the case against Stacey Castor, the focus shifted from isolated incidents to motive, intent, and opportunity. Prosecutors began constructing a timeline that showed how each death fit into a broader pattern of behavior. They examined Stacey's financial situation, uncovering that she had benefited from life insurance policies following the deaths of both husbands. While financial gain alone does not prove guilt, it provided context that strengthened the case. The timing of the policies, combined with the method of poisoning, suggested planning rather than chance. What once seemed like unfortunate coincidences now appeared interconnected. The investigation also scrutinized Stacey's interactions with medical professionals and law enforcement after each death. In both cases, she had positioned herself as a caregiver, recounting symptoms and events in ways that minimized suspicion. Yet, subtle inconsistencies emerged. Statements she made regarding timing, preparation of food and drinks, and her own movements did not always align. These discrepancies, while small, accumulated into a portrait of someone managing information carefully. Investigators noted that Stacey often volunteered explanations before being asked, a behavior sometimes associated with attempts to control narratives. Attention turned to the practical mechanics of the poisonings. Antifreeze is not immediately lethal and often produces symptoms that resemble common illnesses, including nausea and fatigue. This characteristic allows ingestion to be mistaken for natural causes, particularly if medical attention is delayed. Investigators theorized that antifreeze had been mixed into protein shakes consumed over time, gradually causing organ failure. The sweetness of ethylene glycol would have masked its presence, especially when blended with flavored supplements. This method allowed repeated exposure without immediate detection. Prosecutors also explored Stacey's knowledge base. Records showed that she had searched for information related to antifreeze poisoning and its effects. While internet searches alone are not definitive proof, their timing was significant. The searches coincided with periods when her husbands were ill. Combined with the handwritten note left near Ashley, which attempted to redirect blame, these actions suggested awareness of both cause and consequence. Investigators concluded that Stacey understood how antifreeze worked and how it might be misinterpreted medically. The attempted poisoning of Ashley became a critical turning point. Unlike her husbands, Ashley survived and was able to provide insight into her relationship with her mother. She described Stacey as controlling and manipulative, particularly in moments of stress. Ashley's account challenged the image Stacey had cultivated as a grieving spouse and attentive parent. The forged suicide note was presented as evidence of an effort to evade responsibility by shifting blame onto her daughter. This act, prosecutors argued, demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice even familial bonds to preserve self-interest. During trial preparations, prosecutors carefully structured their case to avoid reliance on emotion alone. They emphasized scientific evidence, timelines, and behavior patterns. Expert witnesses explained how antifreeze poisoning affects the body and why it is difficult to detect without specific testing. Medical professionals testified that both Michael and David's symptoms were consistent with ethylene glycol exposure. Handwriting experts confirmed that the suicide note had been written by Stacey, undermining claims of Ashley's involvement. Each expert testimony added clarity to what had once been murky. The defense challenged the prosecution's narrative by arguing that the case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. They suggested alternative explanations for the presence of antifreeze and questioned the interpretation of digital searches. They portrayed Stacey as a woman who had experienced repeated tragedy and was being unfairly targeted due to coincidence. However, prosecutors countered that coincidence could not reasonably explain the repetition, similarity, and escalation of events. They reminded jurors that crimes committed within private spaces often leave patterns rather than witnesses. As the trial unfolded, the contrast between Stacey's public demeanor and the evidence presented became increasingly stark. Jurors heard recordings of her statements, reviewed financial records, and examined the timeline of events. The prosecution highlighted how Stacey had adapted her explanations over time as new information emerged, adjusting details to fit developing narratives. This adaptability was framed not as confusion but as deception. The methodical nature of the poisonings, prosecutors argued, required patience and calculation. The case also prompted broader discussion about how trust operates within intimate relationships. Protein shakes, meals, and shared routines are typically expressions of care. In this case, they became tools for harm precisely because they were trusted. Prosecutors emphasized that the familiarity of the method was what allowed it to succeed initially. By exploiting routine and trust, Stacey was able to conceal her actions until patterns became undeniable. This betrayal formed the emotional core of the case without relying on sensationalism. By the time closing arguments approached, the narrative had solidified. What began as unexplained illness and tragedy had evolved into a case defined by repetition, manipulation, and intent. The jury was asked to consider not only individual pieces of evidence, but how they fit together as a whole. The prosecution argued that when viewed collectively, the evidence told a clear story of deliberate poisoning and attempted evasion. The defense urged caution and restraint, reminding jurors of the seriousness of their decision. As deliberations loomed, the outcome would determine whether the quiet routines of one household would be recognized as the setting for a calculated crime rather than a series of tragic accidents. As the jury deliberated, the courtroom waited under a weight that had been building for years. The evidence they were asked to consider was complex, built not on a single dramatic act, but on repetition, pattern, and intent. Prosecutors had argued that Stacey Castor's crimes were quiet by design, hidden within routines that appeared caring and ordinary. The defense maintained that the case rested on assumptions rather than certainty, urging jurors to separate suspicion from proof. Ultimately, the question before them was whether the pattern of deaths, the method used, and the attempted framing of Ashley could reasonably be explained as coincidence. The verdict brought clarity. Stacey Castor was found guilty of second-degree murder for the death of Michael Wallace and attempted murder for poisoning her daughter Ashley. Although she was not convicted in connection with David Castor's death due to legal limitations and timing, the court allowed his death to be presented as evidence of pattern and intent. The conviction marked the end of Stacey's carefully maintained narrative and the beginning of formal accountability. She was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, ensuring that she would spend the remainder of her life in custody. For Ashley, the verdict carried complicated meaning. She had survived not only physical harm, but the profound betrayal of realizing that her own mother had attempted to end her life to escape responsibility. In court, Ashley spoke about the lasting impact of that betrayal, describing how trust had been irrevocably broken. Her testimony underscored the human cost of the crimes beyond the legal outcomes. While the sentence brought a measure of justice, it could not undo the damage inflicted within her family. The case of Stacey Castor resonated far beyond the courtroom because of how ordinary it appeared on the surface. There were no dramatic crime scenes or public confrontations. Instead, the crimes unfolded slowly, concealed within domestic routines that most people associate with safety and care. Investigators and legal experts later noted that this ordinariness was precisely what allowed the crimes to go undetected for so long. When harm is delivered through familiar rituals, suspicion is often delayed. Medical professionals who followed the case emphasize how antifreeze poisoning can evade early detection. The symptoms often mimic common illnesses, and without specific testing, the cause may be missed entirely. In Stacey's case, that delay proved fatal for 2 men and nearly fatal for her daughter. The case prompted renewed awareness within the medical community about the importance of considering toxic exposure when symptoms do not align with typical diagnoses, particularly in repeated or unexplained cases. The investigation also highlighted the role of forensic persistence. Early rulings that categorized Michael Wallace's death as accidental were revisited only after patterns became impossible to ignore. This reevaluation demonstrated how conclusions can change when cases are examined collectively rather than in isolation. Investigators later acknowledged that hindsight revealed missed warning signs, but they also emphasized that the eventual outcome showed the value of reopening cases when new evidence or context emerges. Public reaction to the case was marked by a mix of disbelief and reflection. Many struggled to reconcile the image of a spouse preparing health drinks with the reality of those drinks being used as a delivery method for poison. The contrast forced uncomfortable questions about how well people truly know those closest to them. Commentators noted that the case challenged assumptions about danger, shifting focus from external threats to those that can exist within trusted relationships. In prison interviews conducted years later, Stacey Castor continued to deny responsibility for the deaths, maintaining versions of events that conflicted with the evidence presented at trial. Her continued denial did little to alter public perception, which had been shaped by the thorough documentation of her actions. For many, the case was no longer about debate, but about understanding how manipulation and control can coexist with outward normalcy. The legacy of the case is shaped as much by prevention as by punishment. Law enforcement agencies have cited it in training discussions about recognizing patterns in domestic deaths and understanding how poison can be used subtly over time. It has also been referenced in conversations about the importance of listening to survivors, particularly when their accounts challenge dominant narratives. Ashley's survival and willingness to testify were central to exposing the truth, demonstrating how one voice can alter the course of an investigation. For the families of Michael Wallace and David Castor, the resolution came too late to save their loved ones, but it provided acknowledgement that their deaths were not meaningless or forgotten. The court's recognition of pattern affirmed that what happened to them mattered, even if legal accountability could not be applied equally in both cases. Their stories became part of a larger understanding of how Stacey's actions unfolded across years rather than moments. The poisoned protein shake became a symbol in the case, representing how easily trust can be exploited. What was meant to promote health became a vehicle for harm, chosen precisely because it would not raise suspicion. This detail continues to unsettle audiences because it transforms an everyday object into a reminder of vulnerability. The case demonstrates that danger does not always announce itself loudly, and that vigilance often requires looking beyond appearances. In the end, the story of Stacey Castor is not defined solely by the method she used, but by the calculated repetition of her actions and the attempt to rewrite responsibility when those actions came close to being exposed. Her conviction closed one chapter of the case, but its lessons continue to echo. It stands as a reminder that patterns matter, that routine can be manipulated, and that even the quietest crimes leave traces that, when examined carefully, can lead to the truth.